Today I'm going to show you 6 ridiculously simple things you can do to improve your fantasy novel. What's amazing about these techniques is they're only going to take you a couple of minutes to implement, but they're going to have a massive positive impact on the quality of your reader's experience. And I know that because these are techniques I've used in the fantasy novels I've published, and I've also taught these to many of the writers I've worked with and seen amazing results. So the first technique I want to cover here is something that involves just one sentence, and it's one sentence that readers are going to absolutely love if you can do this right. Now, to explain what this is, I want to bring up an example from The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson. So around about, I want to say 2/3 of the way through this book, Kaladin, who's one of our main characters here, is given this phrase by a friend of his, and that phrase is journey before destination. What's interesting about this phrase is this is something that is repeated several times in this book and then several times across the series. It's actually used 10 times in this book, and the first time it's said to Kaladin, he doesn't, really understand what it's about. He kind of hears that this is a phrase that belongs to this ancient order of Knights Radiant, but he just kind of thinks, oh, that's sort of a bit silly. What does that even mean, right? But then as the story progresses, it actually becomes a tremendous source of strength for him. When he's going through these difficult moments, he reminds himself, journey before destination. And then in the epilogue of The Way of Kings, another character, Dalinar Kholin, this reformed warlord figure, he has this vision where he is confronted by this sort of godlike entity. And the godlike entity tells him, journey before destination. The Knights Radiant must stand again. And so we kind of come full circle here. What this particular technique is something called an arc phrase. An arc phrase is a motto that is repeated over and over again throughout your story as a way to add in additional layers of emotion and meaning each time. And the really cool thing about an effective arc phrase is that if you set it up well with the initial repetitions of an arc phrase throughout your story, when you insert that arc phrase at a key climactic moment of your story, a moment where your character maybe decides to, finally stand for something, or they finally embrace this transformation they've been struggling against throughout the whole narrative, the inclusion of that arc phrase is kind of this potent emotional bullet that is compressing all this meaning that has been built up throughout the story to deliver it in a massive punch. Now, in my own writing, this is something that I actually kind of stumbled across almost by accident when I was writing Across the Broken Stars. I realized that there was this sort of 2-sentence arc phrase that my main character had said at the start of the story, where he's reflecting on how he'd always been a coward and he always would be. That's a phrase that was just put there at the start of the story when I was writing it. Then there's a scene in the climax where my main character kind of goes through this progression towards changing his ways from being a coward to actually being a brave man. And so at the end, we get a mirror of that arc phrase, where Leon thinks to himself, he'd always been a coward, but he didn't have to be one now. And so that is a very simple version of an arc phrase where it's just 2 instances of repeating it, but it has a lot of potency. And so my key point here is that you probably have a great arc phrase sitting in your manuscript right now. See if you can lean into that. See if there's a way that you can kind of weave this arc phrase into key turning points in your story, into key emotional moments or key moments of character transformation and growth. Now, to explain the second really simple but really powerful writing technique here, I want you to imagine a scenario where you've got a character who is climbing up a tall mountain, and at the top of the mountain, he's going to go to a cave where his mentor lives, and he's going to get some guidance from his mentor. Now, in one scenario, let's imagine your character goes up to that cave, and the mentor is standing there like a statue waiting for him. Then the mentor, begins talking, and they kind of go through their training together. Now, there's nothing necessarily wrong with that, but let me give you a second scenario here. Let's imagine that when your main character gets up to that mountainous cave, the mentor is painting on the side of the cave wall, or perhaps they're tending to some wild goats and they're feeding the goats that are around the cave. Or maybe they're doing some knitting by a fire that is smoldering from last night. What you've just done there is drop a depth hint. This is a technique where you are essentially showing us that there is more to this character than just their relationship to your protagonist. Because a really common mistake that a lot of new fantasy writers make is that you pour so much effort into developing your main character that sometimes your secondary characters feel like they just exist to serve your protagonist's story. And so a little depth hint, like what I've just suggested here with this mentor figure, it kind of makes you feel like this person has a life outside of the story. It makes you wonder, oh, what do they get up to when they're waiting for the protagonist to come visit them? And this doesn't just apply with your characters, you can do it with your world building elements as well. In the War Eternal series by Rob J. Hayes, there is this great little offhanded mention in the first book, Along the Razor's Edge, where we learn that there is this desert. And out in this desert, there is like a rip in reality, and there are just these gigantic, luminous eyes that are staring down through that rip. And this is a little detail that Rob just threw into that first book without actually thinking about how it works. And I know that for a fact because we used to do a podcast together and he told me this. And yet it was just something when I read it where I felt, oh my gosh, this world it's so expansive and it's so full of mystery. And there's this unclosed loop in my mind now. And that's really the key with depth hints is you want to create these little unclosed loops that will linger in the reader's mind and give them reasons to ponder your story long after they've closed the final page. The third really simple but really effective writing technique I want to talk about actually has to do with world building. So this is something that I covered in a recent interview I did with Christopher Rocchio, the author of the fantastic Sun Eater series. Here's what I said. I think a lot of new writers think that they need to fully develop every single aspect of their world, as you mentioned. But in my experience, it's really about just doing one or two immersion anchors. And an example of an immersion anchor is in, Empire of Silence, right? You get Hadrian onto a ship and you explain that there's this thing called a fugue. And when you go in the fugue, it drains the liquid from your body, it stores it separately, it injects in this particular substance. And what you're doing there is you're going in just a little bit more detail, right? Because another author might just go, oh, and then he went in the cryosleep pod and then he woke up, right? And that's fine. You can absolutely do that. But by just adding those few extra details about how this works, it kind of tricks the reader into imagining that you have scientifically, gone through all this research and study on how to actually preserve a human body. And that little immersion anchor you've given us there, which maybe only takes 100, 200, 300 words, it then means that when you briefly mention some other technology or some other aspect of the world, the reader goes, cool, I believe you, because you proved world building competence with this one thing before. And it means that when you just gloss over something else, I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt and imagine that you have also developed it to the same extent. Now, a really fantastic resource for writing an effective immersion anchor in your story is the Ultimate Guide to Rebuilding Civilization, who are actually sponsoring today's video. So this is a really awesome book that basically chronicles all the major inventions we've ever created as a species. And what I really love about it is you can just flip to a random page. So you might flip to a page on mining technology, for instance. And it's going to give you so many little details that you can feed into your story to make it feel more immersive and realistic without actually requiring you to become an expert in this particular domain. So for example, if I was writing a sequence where my characters were exploring an ancient mine, I could go to the mining page in this book and I could find some little details here to bring in added realism and immersiveness to my story. So for example, I might look at the detail of how miners will often use canaries to test whether dangerous gases are present in the air because canaries are going to lose consciousness from a lack of oxygen before humans will. And that's where we get the phrase canary in a coal mine from. That right there is just a few little sentences, a few little details about how the world works, which makes your reader truly believe that they are experiencing a real place. So if you want to grab a copy of the Ultimate Guide for Rebuilding Civilization yourself, you can use the link down below this video. Thanks again to Hungry Minds Publishing for sponsoring this video. Now, this fourth principle I want to cover here is something that will only take you like 1 or 2 minutes to do at most, but it could save you hours of staring at a blank screen and making no progress. So I kind of realized this a long time ago with my writing. I realized that if I knew what I was going to write next, then usually I would be less blocked and I would always have this kind of clear pathway going forward. This is why I'm such an advocate of outlining. But even with outlining, sometimes you can sit down and you can stare at your screen and you just don't really know how to start the day's writing. This is why I quite like to do something I call a daily writer's brief. Think of this almost like a warm-up for your creative muscles. All it involves is, before you start writing for the day, just take out a sticky note or an index card or a sheet of paper and write down a few brief dot points about what you're planning to accomplish with your story for that day. So it could be as simple as saying, all right, my character is going to go to the markets, they're going to buy this thing, and then a guard is going to recognize them from their failed heist last night, and they're going to chase them through the markets. They're going to escape by jumping into the river and swimming away. You'll be really surprised by how much more efficient your writing becomes just having that little bit more of a plan to approach the day's work. And it's always something that I come back to whenever I'm feeling a little bit sluggish with, what to do next with my writing. And if you've never tried it before, I highly, highly recommend that you give it a go the next time you sit down to write. The fifth simple principle to write better fantasy stories is to ask yourself the following question. And this is a question that can come usually in the editing process, but depending on how many scenes you've already written, you may be able to do it right now. And the question is this: if you had to cut 3 scenes from your novel, what scenes would they be and why? The reason why I picked 3 scenes here is because cutting 1 scene is maybe easy, but 3 is starting to get a little bit painful, a little bit close to the bone. And I don't necessarily say this just to get you to shorten your novel, although that is generally a good idea. I find that most new fantasy writers are overwriters and can benefit from a lot of compression, but it's more about giving you clarity around what your story is actually about. Because when you've gone through this process and you've picked your 3 scenes to cut, I want you to really take a critical eye at these different scenes. Perhaps these scenes are covering a particular subplot that is just not that interesting, or the scenes are following around a side character who, isn't really as engaging as your main character. And the intent behind this exercise is to help you realize, okay, maybe these elements from the story, they're not really pulling their weight at the moment. So you then have 2 choices. You either have to figure out a way to make them more entertaining so that they can justify staying in your manuscript, or maybe it's a good idea to cut them. And maybe if there is a subplot in these 3 scenes that just isn't that interesting or engaging, and that's why you want to cut the scenes, then perhaps you need to apply that critical eye to the rest of the subplot and ask yourself, okay, if the subplot is boring in this 1 scene here, is it also boring in these 4 or 5 other scenes that touch upon it? And then the 6th and final technique that will only take you a couple of minutes to do is also another editing one, and it is to remove weasel words. So I literally have a designated editing pass when I'm going through and doing my edits for my stories, where I will just have a list of common weasel words that I tend to overuse. A weasel word is something that doesn't really add a lot of value to your prose and typically can be changed out for a more powerful, more effective word. So here's a list of some common weasel words that I usually try to find in my own writing. You can see words here like very, quiet, rather, just, really, and pretty. Generally, you can replace these words with much more powerful descriptions or much more powerful alternatives, or you can simply delete them from your prose instead. And if you're wanting to write better prose in your fantasy novel, it's really critical that you understand the 7 levels of the pyramid of prose. That's a concept I cover in much more detail inside this video over here, which is a full deep dive to help you write better prose in your fantasy novel with lots of examples along the way. Keep writing and keep striving.